series on violence against children and inspired strategies. My name is Diana Filatova, and I'm responsible for Violence Against Children program at BICE, Bureau International Catholique de l'Enfance. Our organization is a French-based NGO with a network of members all over the world, and we are very happy to offer this new learning opportunity to our members and to have international and national actors working in the field of violence against children. The realization of this joint event was possible thanks to the support of the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and we are very grateful for their help and this opportunity. We will open our web series today with the presentation of Inspired Strategies by Sabine Rakotomalala from the Global Partnership. Her presentation will be followed by a questions and answers session, so do not hesitate to prepare your questions in advance.
So good morning, good afternoon, bonjour, bon après-midi, buenos dias. I'm really looking forward. I've been working for a few years already with Diana. My name is Sabine Rakotomalala. I work for the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and BICE is one of the members of the Global Partnership. And for several years, we've been organizing events with BICE to get Inspire out into the world. And it's really an honor to speak at this gathering today, because having professionals such as yourselves committed to ending violence against children is a signal of real intent to make a difference in your countries. And we really need to make a difference. I'm going to present for about 40 minutes, and then I think we'll have a 10 to 15-minute break, and then we have time to questions. I'm not used to speaking for 40 minutes. I really don't like monologues, so I really look forward to your questions. So we can go into the first slide. Thank you. So globally, we know that 1 billion children suffer from violence every year. We didn't have this data before. This is data that we have since 3 years, where we've seen that a national representative survey data from 96 countries show that 1 billion children, that means 1 out of 2 children, 2 to 17 years old, have experienced emotional, physical, or sexual violence in the past year. These numbers are enormous. And even though these numbers are enormous, we know from another meta-analysis that in fact, self-reported child sexual abuse is 30 times higher than what official reports say, and physical abuse is 75 times higher than official reports. So we're really seeing just the tip of the iceberg. Next slide. If we look at the magnitude of violence against children, I think it's important to look at the different types of violence and how it affects boys and girls differently. So we see that homicide is among the top 5 causes of death in adolescence. And those of you that are based in South America, we know countries like Honduras or El Salvador, Mexico, with high rates of homicide. And this is often targeted at boys. 80% of homicide victims are boys. Beyond the deaths, there's many more children affected by violence. We know that 1 in 4 children suffer from physical abuse, and nearly 1 in 5 girls is sexually abused at least once in her lifetime. Just to give you an example, we know that the lifetime prevalence of child sexual abuse is 18% for girls and 8% for boys. So not only is it important to really understand the data of violence in your country, but also to disaggregate this data by age groups and by gender. Next slide. What do we talk about when we talk about violence? We talk about all forms of violence. We talk about child maltreatment. This begins at less than 5 years old. Some of you may have heard of the shaken baby syndrome, when parents are so frustrated and so tired that they shake their baby. And that's a form of child maltreatment, which can go on for many years. We speak of bullying, which happens more around the time that children start going to school, around 5-6 years, and goes on until the age of 18 and 19. Today, we have the added component of online bullying. Then we speak of youth violence. Here, the data looks at gang violence, and this happens between 10 and 17 years old. Then we have intimate partner violence, or called dating violence. So this is young couples where we see violence. I live in Switzerland, and in one of the cantons where I live, a recent study just showed that 7 out of 10 girls below the 18 suffer from intimate partner violence. So this is very current situation. We don't have to look forward to see this intimate partner violence happening. Then we have sexual violence, most often perpetrated by somebody close to the child across the whole lifespan. And then emotional or psychological violence and witnessing violence. Witnessing violence, so a child looking at his parents beating each other, is just as violent for the child as for the victim who's being beaten, the mother or the father. So witnessing violence is also considered as one of the forms of violence, which is why we work closely with the groups that work on domestic violence and violence against women. Next slide. Diana, please don't hesitate to interrupt me if I'm going too fast for the translators, or if you have any questions or suggestions. So if we look at the health consequences of violence, we see there's very different categories. The first ones are injuries, the more common ones. For example, death linked to homicide, or shaking the child, is, of course, can also lead to death or severe brain injuries. Then we have health risk behaviors, such as smoking, alcohol and drug abuse, and unsafe sex. We know that children that suffer from violence often engage in this type of behavior. Then we see mental health problems, PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicide, severe mental health problems, and there's a lot of evidence about this. We have maternal and child health problems. For example, unintended pregnancies, HIV/AIDS, communicable diseases such as HIV/AIDS. And then what I find the most interesting in this diagram is the non-communicable diseases, such as cancer, cardiovascular diseases, and diabetes. I work for the Global Partnership to End Violence, but I'm outposted in the World Health Organization. And I find it fascinating to know that these forms of violence that happen in childhood that often lead to risky behavior, that in their turn lead to big, expensive diseases such as cardiovascular diseases, cancers, and diabetes. So if you want to leave now, you can leave. If I can ask you to please use these 3 slides that you just saw for any advocacy that you do with your governments, with your boss, with your family, with your community, then I would be happy. Because the magnitude of the problem, the types of violence, and the health consequences are just enormous. And the world doesn't know or understand this yet. But I'm not somebody that likes to talk about problems. So we're going to go to the next slide. And for the next few slides, we're going to talk about solutions. Sorry, yeah, just go back one. Yeah. In 2016, I would say this is what the world looked like. We realized that if you spoke to UNICEF, they would say, oh, response services or child protection system strengthening is important. Then you would speak to Plan International and they would say, no, it's about economic strengthening. The WHO would say it's about survivor care of the health sector. UNODC would talk about children in detention centers. So every organization was talking about their own way, in their own way about exactly the same problem, and stakeholders were all moving in different and sometimes opposite directions. So in 2016, we came together for 3 things. The first one was the Sustainable Development Goal 16.2, which all member states agreed we have to end violence against children. Second one was the launch of the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. And the third one was the launch of Inspire. The aim is to achieve collective action. So to move from a situation where everybody's going in different directions to come together so that the effects are bigger than the sum of the individual contributions. Over the next, next slide. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to walk you through what might, I didn't only want to present Inspire, I just want, because that's the technical package, the second icon you see, but I want to walk you through these 6 components, which are so essential for achieving collective impact. So the first one is the clear logic model. And you as NGOs, partners, need to be sure that you have a clear logic model before you start writing up your proposal and and implementing your proposal. Next slide. Sorry, we're on slide. I'm looking at a different slide deck. Sorry, yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So if you look at the clear logic model, we know that you need to have a clear understanding of the problem. You need to have a clear understanding of the causes, what works and for whom, and then need to think about scaling up the policy and programs. And the reason I say this is that we often, and I've worked for an NGO for 10 years, and often we would set up a program, think it was great, and then replicate it elsewhere. But I think what I didn't do enough in my career is think, okay, let's look at the data. Let's analyze which target group and which age group and which gender. What is actually causing the violence to this group? Then think carefully which of the interventions would be most appropriate to address that problem. And then implement it thinking, how could it be replicated or scaled up, either in other countries or throughout the same country. So I think it's really important when you're writing your proposal to have a very clear logic model that you can explain to somebody in 5 minutes about why you're doing the intervention you're doing. Next slide. Next slide. Today I'm going to focus most of the presentation on the Inspire technical package. And then after, we'll continue about the monitoring, partnerships, communications, and political commitment. Next slide. So as mentioned, the Inspire core document was launched in 2016, along with the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. Each strategy has a key objective, the rationale, which SDG targeted contributes to, and what are the effects when we implement that strategy. So you will see that in 2016, we developed the Inspire the core document. 2 years later, we developed the Inspire handbook and then the indicator framework. And I'll walk you through these 3 documents briefly. Next slide. So what are the 7 Inspire strategies? In English, it's great. Malheureusement pas en français ou en espagnol. So it's Inspire, it's an acronym. I is the first strategy, is implementation and enforcement of laws. N is for norms and values. S is safe environments. P is parent and caregiver support. I for economic strengthening. R for response services. And E for education and life skills. So easy to remember for Anglophones. The reason we've come up with these 7 strategies with the core agencies, UNICEF, WHO, UNODC, UNESCO, and then CDC, the Global Partnership to End Violence, is because these are the strategies that everybody felt that they could coalesce around. Next slide. For each of the Inspire strategies, we have an approach which gives a category of programs. We highlight which sector is involved. And then we have a section on cross-cutting activities like multi-sectoral action, multi-sectoral coordination, and monitoring and evaluation. I love this slide because it shows which sectors are involved in which strategy. Often, I've been to many countries over the past years, and it's very hard to get health to speak to social services or the justice sector to speak to the health sector. And I think when you bring people together around an Inspire training, and I hope you will be able to deliver Inspire trainings yourself, then it's a very nice way to bring the different sectors together. Here we see, for example, that justice is involved in the implementation of laws, that for norms chain, you often work with schools, with the welfare sector and community health workers. For the response one, which is the red one, we often work with, the green one, you often work with health and welfare. For economic strengthening, you work with finance and labor. So this gives everybody a place around the table to show what their contribution is to ending violence against children. Some of the core components of Inspire is sorry, next slide. Are you still on the right slide? Yeah. Some of the core components of Inspire is that they're specific interventions, that it shows the relationship to sustainable development goals. But for me, the most important is that it's evidence-based. Next slide. What does evidence-based mean? It means that the 48 programs that are mentioned in Inspire within the 7 strategies have been scientifically evaluated, and they have been found to be effective. At the minimum, they're based on the best available research that exists. So it's either effective, prudent, or a promising practice. And this is really important. Again, I've set up many programs from Pakistan to Colombia to Côte d'Ivoire to Mozambique, and they were never evidence-based. I thought they were good, but that was my personal opinion as a child psychologist. Today, I would never act the same way. I would really look at the programs in Inspire and see how I can adapt my program to make sure that it fits and replicates the core components of what I'm seeing in Inspire. So ideally, you want full fidelity, because you know that a program works in one place. You want full fidelity to that program to see if it also works in another place. And we can go into a bit more detail after. But two important concepts that I've raised now, one is multi-sectoral action, and the second one is evidence-based practice. And really remind yourself of the evidence-based practice. Next slide. I think this is not so relevant. Next slide, on prevention. This is the third absolutely essential concept around Inspire, prevention. Again, myself having worked for many years in the field of violence against children, we see that we're often working with children who have already been sexually or physically abused, or have been married as children, or are in situations of child labor, or have been through female genital mutilation, or have been child soldiers. But we too rarely work on the prevention side of things. And so in the public health language, we speak about different types of prevention. So you speak of primary prevention, which is prevention before occurrence, so before it happens. And that can be universal. So that can be, for example, through campaigns, or it can be targeted. And that could be, for example, working in especially vulnerable areas or hotspots of a city. So that's primary prevention. Then you have the secondary prevention, which focus on the more immediate response to the victim and to prevent reoccurrence of violence. And this includes, for example, emergency service, treatment of sexually transmitted diseases following a rape. So to make sure that the situation doesn't get worse. And then the third one is tertiary prevention, or prevention of impairments. And here we're looking at approaches that focus on long-term care, such as rehabilitation and reintegration, to reduce the long-term disability associated with violence. So for here, you can imagine a child that has been sexually abused for years, and then the psychological care that he or she would receive to avoid depression, suicide, alcohol abuse, and so on. So that's the tertiary prevention. So again, a very key concept is this prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And if you go back and look at the Inspire 7 strategies, you see that only one of them is a response strategy, and all 6 others are actually primary prevention strategies, preventing before it occurs. Next slide. So now I'm going to just give you an example of one program in each of the Inspire strategies, just to give you an idea. There are 47 programs in Inspire, so I suggest you read it. The document is 52 pages, but I just want to make you want to read it. So I'll give you one example of each strategy of a program that's mentioned in Inspire. Next slide, on implementation and enforcement of laws. So this is the first strategy, implementation and enforcement of laws. And within implementation and enforcement of laws, we have different approaches. So we have laws banning violent corporal punishment, laws criminalizing sexual abuse and exploitation, laws that prevent alcohol misuse, and laws limiting access to firearms. So you'll see there are about 6 or 7 case studies about laws that have been implemented and where we've actually seen a reduction in the prevalence of violence against children. Next slide. The one that I'm going to focus on is an example of a law enforcement in South Africa of the Firearms Control Act. What happened here is that there was a strict licensing and reduced circulation of firearms, which resulted in saving over 4,500 lives, particularly among adolescent males, across 5 years in South Africa's 5 biggest cities. So here we see how a law on firearms can actually have a huge reduction on violence prevention and on violence against children. Two other laws that are mentioned, or two other examples that are mentioned in Inspire are, of course, Sweden, where the law banning corporal punishment led to an almost 99% reduction of corporal punishment in Sweden. It started with a norms change campaign in the 60s after the war, and then the law came after the norms change campaign. And today, smacking your children in Sweden is completely unacceptable. Another example in Colombia is a law that was implemented on alcohol misuse, where they closed bars. Instead of closing them, I think it was at 11 p.m., they closed them at 5 p.m., and they saw an immediate reduction of violence against children. I think recently, if I'm not mistaken, in South Africa, the same happened because of COVID. People were drinking a lot, men were drinking a lot, and so they closed bars, and they also saw a reduction in domestic violence. But I'm not sure if there's an evaluation about that yet. I think it might just be a media report. So that's an example of implementation enforcement of laws. Next slide. In terms of norms and values, we see programs around gender and social norms, community mobilization, and bystander interventions. I think the most simple way for me to explain this is that we need to change two absolutely essential things. One are norms around gender. So the way a man will treat his woman will influence the way he or she treats his child. And this includes even things like paternity leave, giving empowering the woman to manage the cash in the household. So if there's an equitable relationship between the man and woman, the husband and wife, then the relationship with the child will also be very different. And the second social norm that absolutely has to be changed is abuse of power. And this is in countries where we work with perpetrators to show that the power they have over children. And I'm sure that you've seen this in many situations yourself. So the aim is, of course, to change the attitudes and norms in a society as an important part of preventing violence against children. And this is probably the most difficult one, I have to say. Next slide. The example that I give here is a program called SASA, which some of you may know. We know that children witnessing domestic violence between parents is one of the ways by which violence is normalized, as I was mentioning earlier, and increases the chances that children will grow up to use this violence themselves. So interventions that can prevent intimate partner violence are so important. And SASA is a community mobilization program. It was developed in Uganda, but is now expanded to many other countries, which shows a reduction of intimate partner violence by 64% and has reduced the proportion of children who witnessed violence by 2/3. The program is actually quite simple. Community workers, community health workers that engage with the communities around intimate partner violence and see a 64% reduction. And of course, a huge impact on children. That's on norms and values, and I'll move ahead to the next slide on safe environments. Sorry, I just want to go back 1 second on the norms and values, because another program, in addition to SASA, which I find absolutely wonderful, is called Cure Violence. And that's a program where you have interrupters that break the spread of violence. And it started in Chicago and New York and is today in about 50 countries. And these are people that live in the community that witness a sort of violence between two people. And just as the violence begins, they come between the two people that are angry with each other and basically break the cycle between them and do mediation to avoid further violence. This has shown up to 80% decrease of violence in different countries, from Honduras to Central African Republic to Syria to Palestine. So if you can remember SASA, try to remember Cure Violence as well, a great program around norms and values. Safe environments. So we have programs that address hotspots, which I'll talk about now. Interrupting the spread of violence, like Cure Violence. and then improving the built-in environment. And improving the built-in environment is really programs that we are used to, like putting lighting at bus stops, creating child-friendly spaces, but also reorganizing communities so that there's a safe place for children to be and to play where parents can watch them. So that's the built-in environment one, which I find always very interesting, and in which you have to work with the ministries of interior to make that happen. Next slide. The example that I want to give you is one from Cardiff, and it's an intervention where they brought together data from police stations and hospitals. So they looked at the hospital admissions. So this is the safe environment strategy, where we saw that by crossing data from police offices and hospital admissions, we could see a huge reduction of violence against children. Next slide, please. The next strategy, and this is really my personal favorite, is parent and caregiver support. For anybody who is a parent or who has parents, which is everyone, we know how very difficult parenting can be. And this intervention not only helps in terms of the norms change, but also helps in terms of, for example, the reduction of corporal punishment, so implementation of the law on corporal punishment, because it provides an alternative for parents. And there are different types of parenting caregiver support. You can have home visits, you can have group settings, you can have individual visits, or you can have comprehensive programs where children go to the creche, for example, and get their support, or throughout school to get the support that they need. Next slide. The example that I want to show you is a program called the Nurse Family Partnership Program. And it was set up in the USA, but it runs in many European countries and in Australia. And it's nurses that help parents, mothers that are about to have a baby. And they discuss with them the difficulties around the delivery, but also what the situation is at home, whether there's domestic violence, whether there's brothers and sisters, whether they're feeling nervous about the birth. And there they've seen over 15 years a 48% reduction in violence against children. So they actually do longitudinal study over 15 years and see that these children from 0 to 15 don't suffer violence, vis-a-vis children that didn't receive this intervention that are suffering from violence. So the parent and caregiver support, in fact, has many, I think over 100 evidence-based evaluations that show that they have a huge impact in the reduction of violence against children. Of course, parent and caregiver support also works for better educational attainment, getting your children vaccinated, better health care, better mental health for the parents and for the children. So parent and caregiver support is absolutely essential. And today, in the COVID situation, we've been working a lot on parent and caregiver support. Next slide, please. Income and economic strengthening, and I'm always happy it comes after parenting, because we've seen that parent and income strengthening programs put together have a huge impact. But we can look separately. When we talk about income and economic strengthening, we see cash transfers, saving and loans, and microfinance. Next slide. The example that I want to show you is one called Image, and it's a microfinance program which was delivered in Kenya or Tanzania, I think. And it showed it's microfinance given to women to empower them, and to 430 women, and it showed a 50% reduction of violence in the household. As mentioned earlier, empowering women really supports the relationship between men and women and the relationship that they have with their child. As mentioned, today in Kenya, they're doing excellent programs linking parenting and income and economic strengthening, and they're seeing even higher reductions of violence against children, 60, 70, 80% of violence against children. I think if I was to set up one program in all the countries in the world, it would be parenting with income and economic strengthening. It's simple, there's a lot of evidence behind it, and it shows immediate reductions on violence against children. Next slide. Response and support services is the most complicated one. It's a big chapter, and it includes identification and referral of children, therapeutic approaches, treatment for juvenile offenders, and foster care or alternative care for children. Next slide. The example that I want to give you is trauma-informed cognitive behavior therapy. I'm a child psychologist, and I find this one exceptionally fascinating because it shows that children that received individual therapy, cognitive behavior therapy after suffering violence, if they received it at an individual level, we saw a 32% reduction of symptoms. And if they received it in group therapy, there was a 42% reduction in symptoms. And the reason I find this fascinating is because I always thought as a psychologist that you would benefit more from individual interventions than from a group interventions. And we'll see that at the school-based level, we have exactly the same type of outcomes. Next slide, please. So that brings me to education and life skills. This is such an important strategy because we want to increase enrollment and we want to teach children about physical and sexual abuse. So we don't only want to end violence within the school, but we want to use the school as a platform to teach them about violence and to teach the parents and to teach the school teachers and to teach the directors about violence, so that there's of course a diminishment of violence against children. Next slide. Again, here we saw reductions of aggressive and disruptive behavior. In school settings, they received life skills training, including socio-emotional training. And we saw a reduction of violence within the schools, 25% when it was given to all the students. And when it was given to a group of students who were especially naughty, we saw a 33% reduction of violence against children. So again, providing these life skills and the social emotional training to children within the school setting shows an immediate reduction of violence against children. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we launched the Inspire core document, and very quickly NGOs said, wait, we can't do this. We can't do exactly these programs like the Cure Violence or the Cardiff model or the social emotional training. We have our own projects. We've been doing them for 10 years. And so we came together as a group and said, okay, let's try to develop a handbook, which gives much more concrete guidance on how you can adapt your program so that it's evidence-based and loyal to the components that work within the programs mentioned in Inspire. Next slide. So the Inspire handbook is 300 pages, much thicker, and it includes information for each strategy on who's the population, what are the core intervention components that you should consider, what are the costs in terms of human and financial resources, and where can you get the manuals, and in which countries is it implemented. So really, if you write a proposal on parenting or on social norms or on school-based violence prevention, you can copy-paste your theory of change from the handbook. It's in French, English, Spanish. You can really use the exact text and then use the information in there to inspire how you want to write, set up your intervention in country. Next slide. You can go on, yeah. So this is what's included in the handbook. As mentioned, the population, the core intervention components, the cost and cost effectiveness, the human resources, where to get the manuals. I really encourage you to look online for the Inspire implementation handbook when you write your next proposal, because it will really help you think through what's needed. Next slide. Next slide. So these are some resource worksheets that we use. In addition to, you can go ahead. In addition to the Inspire implementation handbook, we had organizations saying, but how can we measure whether it's having an impact? This monitoring component is so important. So we have the clear logic model, we have the package, we know what to do. How can we monitor it? Next slide. So we developed the Inspire indicator guidance and result framework. We're very reactive, as you can see, to the requests that we're getting. And you see within, next slide, the Inspire results framework that we came up with core indicators that we think are essential for you to measure. So there's impact indicators, outcome indicators, and output indicators. The impact, we'll see if there's a decrease in the prevalence of violence against children. Very difficult to measure, so forget it. Outcome indicators, are we actually having an impact in terms of the strategy, and then output indicators are you reaching the children that you need to receive in terms of life skills or parenting support. Next slide. So there's a whole set of indicators. You'll see there's, I think, about 60 indicators across the 7 strategies. And then for each of the indicators, next slide, you will see what's the purpose, the data source, so where can you get the information, the operational definition, how you can measure it, and how you can disaggregate the data. Next slide. Next slide. So we've looked at the clear logic model. You know how you want to implement. You have the tools to implement. You even have the tools to monitor. Now you're not by yourself. You're an NGO, a small NGO, maybe in a country, or a big NGO, but you really can't do it without working in partnership. Next slide. We realize in every single country where we're working that it's really important that the government is empowered. We need to make sure that the government is doing what they need to do. It's their responsibility. But they can only do this with support from the NGOs, the UN agencies, the academics. You're not expected to do the evaluations. The academics have to do the evaluations. And other professional associations like nursing schools or health associations of health workers or associations of teachers. And only if all these groups work together in a coordinated manner will we be able to end violence against children. The Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, where I work, does nothing else than encourage that multi-stakeholder coordination and the multi-sectoral coordination between health, education, social services, and justice. Next slide. So please don't think you can do it on your own. Make sure you're working with others. This is just a map of the Global Partnership to End Violence has pathfinding countries. We have 32 countries. And in these countries, we're tracking very closely these different partnership models. So the countries range from Japan and Canada and Finland to Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Zimbabwe, Zambia, El Salvador, Mexico. And I'm happy to give you more information. You can look on our website and you can see which countries are pathfinding countries. But those are countries where we're tracking the partnership components. Next slide. And I'm almost finished. I have 3 more slides. Communications, next slide. We see that once we have the logic model, the program set up, we know the partnership is function. We all need to be working together on clear messages. So if you're in a country, let's say Cote d'Ivoire, or let's say Peru, you need to be clear on what is it that you collectively want to change. In Colombia, for example, now there's a huge movement by government to focus on parenting support and social norms change. And those are, of course, very linked. And so if you have one set of messages and many messengers saying the same thing, I promise you that you will see change. Next slide. And the last one is, of course, political commitment. Next slide. We're so lucky because we have the Sustainable Development Goal targets to end abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. This is the WHO target, which is also to end all forms of violence against children. UNICEF has their targets. And so really we see we have everything that we need. We have the SDG targets that all member states have signed on. We have the technical package of Inspire, so we know how to do it. And we have the partnership where we're bringing members together and countries together in order to achieve the target of 16.2. Next slide. So what is our ultimate vision? Of course, we want to see the number of Inspire-like programs increasing. And our theory of change is that this will really result in an absolute decrease of violence against children.
We would like to start the second part of the session with a short video about the Inspire strategies and the implications of different actors in the fight against violence against children.
Les enfants méritent d'avoir une vie épanouie. Ils doivent pouvoir grandir dans un environnement sûr et entretenir des liens stimulants. Mais c'est 1 milliard d'enfants qui sont touchés par la violence chaque année. Il s'agit là d'une situation terrifiante et désespérée les concernant. Elle constitue également un problème urgent de santé publique. Mais, quelle que soit la situation politique ou économique, les violences faites aux enfants peuvent être évitées. C'est le coût de l'inaction qui est trop élevé. Ne pas agir contre ces violences sape de nombreux autres investissements en faveur des enfants, y compris dans leur santé et leur éducation, causant souvent des dommages à vie aux individus, aux familles et aux communautés de multiples façons, exacerbant les problèmes de santé mentale, d'abandon scolaire, d'usage et consommation abusive d'alcool et de drogue, d'exposition au VIH et au sida et bien d'autres risques. Plus tragiquement encore, elle augmente le risque de nouvelles violences faites à la prochaine génération d'enfants dans un cycle vicieux et destructeur. À qui appartient la responsabilité d'agir? Les gouvernements jouent un rôle clé dans la protection des enfants et la prévention des violences qui leur sont faites. L'une des fonctions les plus importantes de tout gouvernement consiste à faire en sorte que les foyers, les communautés et les écoles soient des lieux où règne une atmosphère positive et bienveillante, tout en veillant à ce que les familles aient les moyens de protéger leurs enfants. Mais il s'agit là d'un défi pour les gouvernements qui sont souvent attirés dans de nombreuses directions différentes par un large éventail de parties prenantes et de citoyens concernés. Le cadre Inspire peut vous apporter son aide. Il s'agit d'un ensemble de 7 stratégies que les gouvernements peuvent mettre en œuvre pour prévenir et combattre les violences faites aux enfants. Les faits montrent déjà que des programmes bien conçus utilisant le cadre Inspire ont permis de réduire les taux des violences de 20 à 50%. Le rapport de situation mondiale 2020 sur la prévention des violences à l'encontre des enfants dans le monde dresse la carte des progrès accomplis dans la mise en œuvre du cadre Inspire dans 155 pays. Il fournit une base de référence pour aider les gouvernements à surveiller leurs progrès dans leur lutte contre les violences. Bien que les gouvernements du monde entier soutiennent les stratégies d'Inspire, le rapport montre qu'il reste encore beaucoup de travail à accomplir pour mettre fin aux violences faites aux enfants. Pourquoi ? Par exemple, 83% des pays disposent des données d'enquête dont ils ont besoin pour protéger les enfants, mais seulement 21% les utilisent pour définir les bonnes données de base et les bons objectifs en matière de prévention. 80% des pays disposent d'un plan d'action national pour prévenir les violences faites aux enfants, mais seulement 20% d'entre eux sont entièrement financés. Et, bien que les lois qui protègent les enfants de la violence soient promulguées partout dans le monde, elles sont mal appliquées. Inspire peut vous aider. Il est urgent que les gouvernements utilisent Inspire pour mettre en application un certain nombre de choses simples. Élaborer un plan d'action national pour réduire les violences faites aux enfants et s'assurer qu'ils disposent d'objectifs précis pour parvenir à cet objectif. Nommer une agence chargée de coordonner les actions multisectorielles et lui donner les ressources dont elle a besoin pour mener à bien son travail. Accroître le financement des approches fondées sur des données probantes pour mettre fin aux violences faites aux enfants. Utiliser les conseils techniques du pack Inspire pour étendre et accroître la portée des programmes. Et enfin, promulguer et appliquer des lois permettant d'assurer l'interdiction absolue de toutes les formes de violences faites aux enfants dans tous les contextes quels qu'ils soient. Pour atteindre la cible 16 des objectifs de développement durable, à savoir protéger les enfants contre la maltraitance, l'exploitation, la traite et les violences, nous devons accélérer considérablement nos progrès. Inspire peut vous aider. Ce rapport peut vous aider.
Maybe just to add that the video was, the Global Status Report was developed, was launched in August this year, and we used Inspire to see what countries are doing to end violence against children using the Inspire strategies. So we're using Inspire in many different ways, for trainings, but also for tracking what countries are doing.
Thank you, Sabine, for your presentation, which allowed us to become familiar with this program Inspire. I have a series of small questions. The first one is with regard to the partnership. The governments and the scholars that need to collaborate. I can hear him very badly. When you speak of organizations, I can hear him very badly. Do you put this as part of the NGOs? Because it seems normal that the children should be part of this.
Vous avez évoqué un certain nombre de pays qui font partie, qui sont des
You
pays
named a
pionniers,
series of
qui font partie de
countries
cette nouvelle partnership. Il y a
that
d'autres
are
pays
part
qui ne
of
sont
this
pas
new
présents et qui
partnership.
sont
Other
représentés sur le panel.
countries
Comment est-ce que
are
ces
not.
personnes-là peuvent travailler sur les stratégies d'extérieur? Comment est-ce que vous pouvez
How
les aider? Comment
can
est-ce
you
qu'ils peuvent
help
contribuer?
these to work on the strategies?
Troisième petite question,
Third
sur la question
small question,
de la collecte de données désagrégées.
the
Les États
question
collectent
of
des données
gathering
de leur côté,
information.
les ONG collectent des données de leur côté également, et les
There's the
agences
data
nationales font de
collection,
même. Mais on a constaté que souvent, il n'y a
but
pas
we
une
noticed
centralisation de
that
l'ensemble des données,
there's no
sauf qu'il y a une
centralisation of the
multiplication des
data.
données. Est-ce que, selon la stratégie extérieure, vous
Based on
arrivez
the strategy, can you
structurer techniquement les États à faire en sorte que les
situate
données fiables,
technically
désagrégées,
these states,
rassemblées dans
gather
un endroit donné pour permettre justement
in a given place?
d'avoir la disposition des données qui vont expirer ensuite le plan d'action.
I cannot hear him.
Dernière question.
Last question.
Ces stratégies, oui, mais est-ce qu'on peut
7
faire
strategies,
parmi ces
yes.
stratégies? Est-ce
But
qu'on
with
peut faire
regard
le
to
choix
these 7 strategies,
de quelques stratégies qui, avec des effets
can
combinés,
we
peuvent permettre justement
choose
d'atteindre
some
un résultat?
strategy?
Et si on devrait choisir,
If
comment
we
est-ce
had to
qu'on devrait le
choose,
faire? Quels seraient les
how
critères?
must we do it? What are the criteria to
Je
choose a
m'excuse d'avoir pris
strategy?
tout le temps.
Sorry if
Merci.
I spoke so long. Thank you.
Est-ce que ça va si je réponds en français, Diana?
Is it
Oui, oui.
okay if I answer in French?
Merci, Yao,
Yes.
merci pour ces excellentes
Thank
questions.
you,
Vraiment,
Yo,
très,
for
très
these
intéressant.
excellent questions. All 4 of them are great. I will take them one by
Premièrement, pour
one.
les jeunes,
Firstly,
effectivement,
for the young,
on se rend
as a
compte
matter of
que
fact,
le
we
travail pour les
realize
jeunes sans les
that
jeunes, ça n'a aucune
working for the young without them has no impact. So at the level of every country, we are pushing governments and the UN when they develop their national plans. We're pushing them to include the young people, and not in a figurative way. Or the idea is for them to really understand the action plan about violence against the children so that they can provide some advice. And as Secretariat for the World Partnership, we monitor these 32 countries to see which ones involve children and which don't. Just to be clear, we're a small secretariat. We're 15 based in New York and Geneva. We're not in the countries. So the World Partnership work in the countries to make things proceed, but we rely on you 100%, the civil societies, UNICEF, WHO to do the work in the countries. What we can do is to monitor what you do and put you in touch among countries and spread the best practices. This leads me to the second question about Inspire. Inspire is not just for pioneer countries. They are 2 separate groups. Inspire Working Group is a working group made of 500 people, and everybody, I can give the link, everybody can become a member of this group to have updates, but these are 2 independent things. The pioneer countries are pushed as far as coordination, data collection, and implementation, but there are also many countries and other organizations and the Committee for Child's Rights, other groups that use Inspire, not connected to the pioneer countries. I do a little bit of marketing about the pioneer countries, because if you're in a country that is not a pioneer country, we rely a lot on NGOs to push their governments to become a pioneer country. For example, Guinea. I don't know if there's anyone from Guinea online. They just passed a law, a very good and strong law about corporal punishment in Switzerland, we usually say that Guinea should be a pioneer country, because if they did this, it's because they're ready to get together on an international platform to show what else they want to do to end violence against the children. And I would refer you to the website of Inspire Working Group and the World Partnership, so you can see what the pioneer countries are. And if you're not there, the door is open to allow your country to be a pioneer country if you believe it should be. About this, the disaggregation of data, we do not do this. It's UNICEF that does this. UNICEF is in charge for the objective 16.2, and they have two incredible things that they're doing. Firstly, they are strengthening the capabilities in most of the countries in the world, the administrative capabilities to collect statistics. Often the countries are not just capable, they don't have the human and financial resources for a good data collection. So UNICEF works with them to strengthen these statistics offices in the countries. And secondly, they have a platform called the UNICEF Data Analytics, where they enter all the information they have. You can see by sustainable development objective, by sexual violence or corporal punishment. There's already a lot of data gathered together, but comparable among countries. We don't have this technical support, but UNICEF gives this technical support to the countries to connect them. Then the strategy, that's a question that we're working on for a few years. What we realize is that each country will in fact choose a strategy that makes most sense. For instance, Colombia worked on parenting and changing of norms, and in order to do this, they first look at the programs they have in their countries. I think they did a mapping. There are 400, 500 programs in Colombia, and they see which ones were evaluated and that have proved effective, where is their technical effectiveness to work, and based on that they choose what will be developed in Colombia. In Colombia, they chose these two strategies. In Nigeria, they decided to work in 6 provinces instead of choosing a strategy. That's also a possibility. In Uganda, I think they worked in 9 districts on all strategies. So there are different ways of broadening this work of Inspire, but this is something that needs to be done based on the resources and skills. I join you in congratulating you for your quality in your presentation. With regard to prevention, primary prevention and tertiary prevention, with regard to the primary one, you spoke about strategies. So these strategies, or especially at the political institutional level, measures and laws to protect the children, does this refer to advocacy, the measuring, the question of proof, and also meeting with the authorities with the possibility to pass laws? Is this strategy in line with advocacy? The second question, with regard to tertiary prevention, when after the secondary accompaniment is done, there is a monitoring that needs to be done after the reinsertion of the person. Unfortunately, this monitoring is limited because usually the ONGs work based on the program. At the end of the program, there are often 2 or 3 monitoring sessions. There are no means to guarantee the monitoring of the people. So is there no challenge at the level of tertiary prevention? How is this method Inspire being applied in Brazil?
La question sur la prévention primaire.
The question about primary prevention, that's excellent. Yes, there's a large part of advocacy, but especially advocacy when it comes to the law on corporal punishment or alcohol abuse, or the laws about alcohol or sexual violence, or even income and financial strengthening. I completely agree with you. It is advocacy. but there's also a part dealing with primary prevention that is done, for example, in schools or in changes in the norms. And I have 3 children. The eldest is 13. Everything she learned about violence was learned in school. She was never a victim, but when she was 5 years old, she learned the importance of her body. When she was 8 years old, she learned about bullying in school. When she was 8, she learned about online bullying. It's difficult because you cannot measure what did not happen, but we are 100% sure that if a child is more aware of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, then they will be in less danger and they'll know where to turn to if they are victims of violence. This is a large part of primary prevention, also changes in norms. We often see campaigns on buses, and we say if you fear to be a victim of violence, if you witnessed violence, do not hesitate to contact. We enter the secondary prevention, but it's still primary, it's not advocacy. With regard to the tertiary, yes, absolutely. It's expensive. It's very expensive to have helplines for the victims and to have monitoring. We know, for example, that the follow-up as far as cognitive therapy is a minimum of 12 sessions, so it's very expensive. And we need, at the same time, if I were a donor, I would put my money in prevention rather than in follow-up, because what we want to do nowadays is prevent, to not have to face the huge cost that follows. What I can say is that we have to push the governments to allot budgets, not just for prevention, but also for the follow-up. The question about Brazil, the question was, what do you do to implement Inspire in Brazil? We work with a partner, 2 major partners. One is a civil society organization based in São Paulo. The other one is a university in São Paulo as well. They translated everything into Portuguese. I think all 3 documents, in fact, have been translated into Portuguese. And I myself traveled twice to Brazil to do a formation on Inspire in Portuguese through the civil society organization. We met with the mayor of Sao Paulo and Pelotas, and these are pioneer cities because Brazil is a pioneer country, but unfortunately, with the current government, we see very little progress. So we decided to concentrate on the cities. And nowadays it's São Paulo and Fortaleza. And in time, we want to continue with Rio and Fortaleza, where there's also a lot of progress in preventing violence against the children. But if you're interested, you can send me an email and I can put you in touch with the groups that we work with. In certain countries, it's really the government that is implementing many things. In other countries, it's rather the civil society.
Great. So we have
Good morning. I very much appreciate the work of Inspire and the work of EVAC, and I think it has real potential in our country. I'm from Canada, one of the Pathfinder countries. But in fact, our government report was very inaccurate, and it makes things look a lot better than they are. And so I'm wondering, what can we do within EVAC to help strengthen the capacity of civil society organizations to better hold their governments to account? And you mentioned that key for you was this multi-stakeholder. It's precisely that from the civil society side we're trying to get going, but it's really slow and unacceptable for a country like Canada. So I'm wondering how we can best work together across these 2 sides to really hold governments to better account than the first report.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Just to be clear, we're not the CRC committee. We cannot hold governments to account. We don't have a mandate to hold governments account. That happens through the CRC reporting, and there's a solid official mechanism through which that happens. The Global Status Report on Violence Against Children is government self-reporting. It could be that in 3-4 years' time, when they do a second one, that we could get CSO involved in the reporting back. The way they did it was quite neutral. They had 10 to 15 people, one data collector, and then 10 to 15 people that independently from different sectors inputted into the data of the global status report. And then the data collector had to get the information from the 10 to 15 people and then find the average information. And that's what came out. It's true some countries seem much better than they are. Other countries seem worse than they're actually doing. But the idea is really that governments look at what they're doing in their own country, think about it, and then hopefully start to act on it.
Well, we have a long ways to go in terms of that.
I would say if you want an official reporting mechanism, write to the CRC, make sure that the shadow reports into the CRC, the UPR reporting, are very solid.
Well, we are under that review now. We are using that channel, but
okay.
I just hope the next round of the global report, we can find a way for those to be more robust. Because when we asked even just to see the evidence they were using behind their report, we didn't get to see that evidence. Well, I would think if there is a collaboration, civil society should be able to see the evidence the government is submitting to support, checking off that it's doing a great job, because our view is it isn't. Thank you.
Hola, buen día.
Yes, hello, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for this space, for this presentation. My question is about one type of violence in particular that perhaps in my region, South America, there is a specific perspective about this, especially because of our recent history with regard to human rights violations and the dictatorships. And this always turns on a light on with regard to institutional violence or violence on the part of the state. I understand that in the case of this type of violence against children, this is gathered in observation 3 with regard to torture and negligent treatment. And in our countries, we are aware of the proof that exists of this violence against children and adolescents in the juvenile criminal justice, and also with regard to, we're talking about the lawfulness, and also with regard to the legal exercise of security forces that not only have an impact on homicides, but also situations of humiliating treatment and torture. So with regard to this specific point, this specific type of violence, my question is there any experience as part of the INSPIRE strategies in some of the member countries, some experience that aims at having an impact on this type of violence? Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. No, I think, to be honest, I don't think INSPIRE is for government-led institutional violence, unfortunately. The only things that I can say is we work in countries like, as you say, I mean, Mexico, Philippines, where the government is, there's a lot of violence, government-led violence, really serious government-led violence. And these are pathfinding countries. And within these countries, I've always found technical government people that are willing to change the situation on violence against children. So even if at the government level, crimes are being committed, there's at other levels still people working to end violence against children, especially for those indigenous groups or groups that are more marginalized from society. So I don't know which country you're from, but like Colombia might be an example where one part of the government is doing one thing, and then there's also another side where there's very committed people working to prevent violence in the households. And the other thing, and I always feel a bit like idealist when I say this, is the work around parenting. I think the more we strengthen the work around parenting, and we hope to really see a reduction and norms change, and the more we strengthen children and the role of parents, we do hope that we will create more peaceful societies. So most people will do it from bottom up, trying to influence governments through the General Assembly and UN and political pressure. And we think that if we can work with young people and parents so that the next generation will be people that are less violent.
Thank you. Thank you. It was to be informed on whether there's a specific line. I understand that that the project is better prepared to address other types of violence. Thank you. Beatrice's question was, how can we use group therapy for children in jail, especially when they don't have the same problems? Perhaps in general terms, the children in conflict with the law or children in prison, are they also under the mandate of Inspire? Are they included in these strategies of Inspire? To answer your question, Dana, for me, Inspire is solutions. We try to focus a little less on the problem because we know there's a huge problem. We know what the consequences are as far as public health, education, economy, human rights. So we try to concentrate on solutions. In fact, the solutions are the 7 strategies are relevant for all sorts of violence, be that the children in jail, prematurely married, the children victims of genital mutilation, forced labor, etc. For me, these are all forms of violence that are unfortunately under a major category of violence, obviously online violence as well. Each type of violence could be helped by Inspire, but each form of violence has its particularities. For instance, online violence, we worked with groups
internet providers
of internet providers or groups like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok to see what they are posting. Obviously, in juvenile justice, it's the same. We work with the state services that are responsible, be that the police or the judges, to reinforce their capabilities as far as detection, follow-up, and the laws to imprison the children and follow up in a child-friendly manner in their process, in their justice process. There are very many things that we do in addition in these types of violence. I would say that Inspire for 70% covers all sorts of violence, and there's a 30% that is very specific. Now about Beatrice's question about individual therapy in justice centers, in prisons, I think not. I think it's impossible to do group therapy. There's nothing about that in Inspire, as far as I know, nothing specifically connected to this question. But I think it's very difficult to do this in group, but each case is so different as far as the cause and what happened. I think that psychological therapy has to be very personalized. I'm in DRC. My concern, I don't know if I can call it a question, it's rather comments to say that we've appreciated the presentation and the different distinctions of stakeholders tells me that borders divide us, but we have the same context, especially with regard to child protection. We should really have access to more activities in prevention, because on this there's a lot of response, but there's less as far as prevention. In DRC, sorry, we tried to look into this, especially in the eastern part. Many children are confronted with traumatic situations, violence, marriages. I refer to previous sessions, and I say that yes, it's true, there's a lot of work to be done at the state level, but the greatest amount of work is at the community level, especially in families, because although authorities may not act, they come from families, inequalities, and beliefs. And even if we apply the law, because the law provides for almost everything, but the implementation, the enforcement is difficult because there are families with inequalities at their core and as references. The work in families, because we already do this with BICE, education. So there's really an aspect to prevent violence against the children. I liked this presentation with regard to families and the teenagers who should already have the basis on an equal level. There was also the work in networking, yes, in partnership. Yes, union leads to strength, but also weakness. For instance, if we have no services, how can we act? How can we establish a network or partnership with less projects at the grassroots level? There's also the identification of the need, but somewhere we have to ensure that the victim can access. We have to also be watchful over the others, but these networks must be established when the services are present, when there are links. On which basis can we collaborate? We need mechanisms to make the services available. The other question with regard to the evaluation of the impact. I think this should be deepened. Are we going to come back to this, or what are the actual methods? Because the outcomes are not really well documented as far as impact. So I'd like to perhaps see what are the tools we can explore so that we can ensure that we can measure the changes, the more significant and beneficial changes. So I'd like to have more tools to be able to capture those and see how we can implement our programs. Thank you very much. Two questions. I think that the main question is about the evaluations. It's not up to you to do the evaluations. I worked for Terre des Hommes, an NGO, for 10 years, and we did evaluations all the time. After 8 years, we realized that there are some scholars that are paid to do this. They study this, they know how to do it very well, and we should be doing this with them. So really, we have to look at the universities or the university groups in Kinshasa or elsewhere that can support you in these evaluations to measure the impact. As you'll see in Inspire, it's very possible to do the evaluation of the impact of your project. Perhaps not as far as preventing violence all over the country, but if you have a target group with which you work, you can compare it with another group and see whether there's a reduction in violence, or in the long term whether there's a reduction. And for this, we have to really work with these scholars. Good morning. This experience is important, and I think that Sabine showed us this combination of theory, politics, and the work at the grassroots level. And I'm left with some taste about the advocacy in the civil society with the state. With an example, I think the experiences are important, but lately, as far as child protection, for instance, for example, we work with young people and adolescents in conflict with the law. The information it's sealed. There's a deep sealing from the state about this information in terms of protection. So it's the state that monopolizes the information.
Información casi vertical a la comunidad internacional. Entonces,
So I think there's a problem in their own countries in terms of protection. The information is kept, and that weakens other perspectives with regard to this advocacy and this relationship established with the law through projects they develop. Perhaps you've had other experiences. We have major inconveniences. Oftentimes in countries, the official web pages have no information. There's a lack of information, or simply the information is not there. Thank you so much. My question, I'm going to summarize it in one. The elements, the components of Inspire speak of strategies and then focus. And on the screen, we see approaches with some points. Some have 4 points, other 3, other 5 points. It would be about broadening the issue of approaches in applying strategies, or at least naming them.
So thank you for the very useful and interesting questions. The first one on the governments, I think it's similar to an earlier question about institutional government-led violence. And I always think the role of civil society is so extremely important, because you're the ones that will make things change at the end of the day. You're the one that will tell government, we're not happy with this. But I think there are different ways to go about it. And one way is to keep getting angry at them and telling them, you're not doing this, you're not doing this. But I've seen in 2 or 3 countries now where governments are really complicated, that the civil society group came together, worked with the government to understand and found the right people in government, or even positioned the right people in government that they could work with, and then very slowly managed to develop the national action plan, start collecting data, start being more transparent about the data. So there was more almost of a coalition between the CSO group and the government. We know that social justice takes time. It won't happen overnight. And I think there's a mix between those that are pushing government and getting angry at government, and those that can work with government in a constructive way. For example, training them on Inspire. I've been in many countries where the CSOs was leading the training on Inspire to governments. So the government sees it as a favor almost. And so that's a nice way of establishing a relationship to then later get what you want. But I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, I can't arrange the politics in your country. But I think the role of civil society can really be twofold. The second question on the approaches of Inspire, I'm not really sure I understood the question, but in Inspire, there are very clear names to the approaches. And it's difficult, of course, to categorize everything, but we tried as much as possible to find categories that are wide enough so that different programs fit into it. And also to say that hopefully in 3-4 years, we'll have a new Inspire. We're collecting new evidence from new programs. There's many programs that are being evaluated every year. And we hope in a few years to have more programs that have evidence behind them that can be included in the new Inspire.
Thank you very much, Sabine. I would like to thank you, all of you, for being with us today. I really invite you to go to a websites of the Global Partnership, UNICEF, WHO, dedicated to Inspire strategies. You can read there a lot of material, a lot of documentations, a lot of new ideas, many examples of promising practices. You can also find contacts of different potential partners implementing activities, already evaluated activities. So it's really rich in material. I would like to say thank you again, Sabine, for your presentation. Perhaps you would like to say a few words for conclusion.
No, I think like I started, the fact that you're all here for 2 hours listening to this is a huge signal that you're willing to change things in your country. So all I can say is thank you, and let's not give up. Let's keep fighting so that in 2030, there's no more violence against children. I believe that it's possible. People today don't smoke anymore in airplanes. People today wear seat belts. Things change in 30 to 40 years. And I really think that violence against children is one of those things that will change. It's no longer acceptable and it's preventable.